TopShop was once the pinnacle of fashion, from its emerging designer collaborations to its own London Fashion Week collections. TopShop was a phenomena in fashion, proving unequivocally that fashion doesn't need to be expensive to be desirable by the fashion elite. But that wasn't to last. After a long period of difficult-to-understand positioning choices, scandals, and high operation costs, not only TopShop, but the entire Arcadia Group fell from a $2 billion valuation to a mere footnote in a previous competitor's portfolio. TopShop is often quoted to have begun in 1964, and it was, but to understand the history of TopShop, I'd like to take you back a little further to 1946, which is when another British retailer, Burton, purchased a company called Peter Robinson, a colossal women's fashion department store chain that was widely loved for their enormous and famous department store on Oxford Street that had opened back in 1924. The acquisition was made to help Burton adapt to the times. You see, Burton, then named the Cross Tailoring Company, was founded in 1903 by a man named Montague Burton and grew very quickly, becoming the largest chain of tailoring stores in the world by 1925, listing on the stock exchange in 1929, and by the end of the war, Second World War, becoming responsible for tailoring a fifth of the men in Britain. Meanwhile, because Peter Robinson was a women's fashion chain, the 1946 acquisition would help Burton as a parent company to target women as a second audience. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any information about how successful this was, but Peter Robinson survived throughout the 1950s as part of the group's 616 stores, so we can at least assume that it did well. But of course, famously, during the 1960s, retailing would change forever after brands realized that the newly coined teenager could be just as profitable of a market as their parents were, leading to the big high street brands like Peter Robinson to specifically target them as an audience, which is how, in 1964, TopShop became the youth brand of Peter Robinson, becoming one of the earliest examples we have today of youth marketing. Not that that term had been invented yet. To do this, they invited in younger, more edgy brands like Mary Quant, Gerald McCann, Jeff Banks, French Connection, and Bradley Cooper to sell in their stores, and even sectioned off the whole area for the teens in the basement of the Peter Robinson store on Oxford Street, a tactic that would have helped visually distance the new demographic. Needless to say, it was very successful in its goal, evidencing just how profitable teens could be. By 1973, in fact, TopShop was so successful that they split as a separate brand from Peter Robinson and was established as their own store, now explicitly targeting 13 to 24-year-olds, and I assume now predominantly selling their own namesake branded clothing, though I couldn't exactly find a date on when that began. By the following year, Peter Robinson was reduced from 22 stores to only 6, while TopShop, now running totally independently, took over all of those spaces, and by 1975 had 55 standalone stores, with more on the way. It was an enormous success, making £1 million not in sales but in profit alone. So after all the costs are taken off, which is around £10.5 million or $32.5 million today, in profit. Throughout the 1980s, again, we don't have a lot of information, but we can again assume it did okay because it survived. Now with the 1978 edition of Top Man, who I will just make a separate video on because that has an equally interesting history. However, with that said, because we have little documented about them in the 80s, I asked my mum, who was in her teens and early 20s at the time, and she said that though she loved Peter Robinson and the Oxford Street store had been a real magnet for teens and young adults, she actually had no idea that TopShop was part of the company. Instead, believing that by the beginning of the 1990s, when TopShop would go through a rebranding, that they were actually rivals to one another and not connected at all, which certainly evidences the need for the company to rebrand every decade or so to retarget the younger end of their demographic, as their target of 13 to 24-year-olds would obviously age out of their demographic each 10 years. So, if my mum's perception of the brand is the average, it's very interesting that this early 90s rebrand heavily distanced the two brands, Because honestly, my mum loves retailing as much as I do, so if she doesn't know that they were the same, effectively, it's very likely that it was a purposeful distancing between the two, much as the separate floor was back in 1964. Interestingly though, this rebrand seemingly was catalysed by Dame Vivienne Westwood, who, after finally winning her British Designer of the Year award in 1990, after many years of being snubbed, something we covered in my very old and now very embarrassing Vivienne Westwood video, stated that she wanted to democratise the world of high fashion and bring production finances back into Britain by doing a collaboration with TopShop, who were a high street brand. Bearing in mind this was at a time when British fashion in general was pretty much completely dead, and a full decade and a half before Karl Lagerfeld popularized the downmarket collab concept with his H&M collaboration, the downmarket idea of Westwood was truly revolutionary, and very quickly TopShop would adopt this as their strategy. Though I couldn't find if Vivienne Westwood actually did a collaboration with TopShop, their first downmarket collaboration would come around the same time as their takeover of the entire Oxford Circus location in 1994 with a brand, and I'm sorry I don't have pictures of this, I even contacted the brand directly and there's nothing, so instead here's the Autumn-Winter 94 collection of the brand, Red or Dead. Red or Dead was a very buzzy, experimental, high fashion label that John McKittrick, Alexander McQueen's mentor, had just left that was also working on a strategy to democratize high fashion, actually succeeding in the process, winning the Street Style Brand of the Year award in 1995, 1996, and 1997, though unfairly losing their perception of being a high fashion brand along the way. You see, unfortunately, this was quite a hard sell. Redefining British fashion, or fashion in general, to be democratized to all was not a popular idea. The whole concept of retailing at that time was far more customer profile based, i.e. giving a name, age, and gender to the target and then push marketing towards them, instead of branding based, which is a pull marketing scheme, i.e. saying this is who we are, this is what we sell, come if that resonates. And because it had cheapened the Red or Dead brand, it was really hard to make this TopShop plan work. But they didn't give up, continuing to focus on that crossover between high fashion and high street as their differentiator. However, while all of this new strategy was developing, coincidentally, it would time up extremely well with the fact that London Fashion Week was all but dead, forcing the British Fashion Council to invent London Collections, which today is known as New Gen, as a program to give young designers a free space at London Fashion Week to show their work. The first of which happened for Autumn-Winter 93 and included Sontag and Mulligan, Lisa Johnson, Paul Frith, Abe Hamilton, Copperwheat Blundell, and famously, Alexander McQueen. From the following year, in order to make London Collections not enormously loss-making, the British Fashion Council looked for sponsorship to the tune of £120,000 per year and found exactly that in Marks & Spencer's, who would sponsor the young designers until 2001. At which time, TopShop would make the pledge to sponsor the new talent, concreting their role in bringing true fashion to Fashion Week and true fashion to consumers, including debuting their own fashion shows in the same year, 2001, but not yet on the London Fashion Week schedule. Finally, after so many years of trying, they had cemented the position that they had been pushing for around a decade, and naturally that meant that investors wanted a piece of the pie. Leading to 2001, when the formerly named Burton Group, now named Arcadia, as a whole, so not just TopShop but all of their other brands, was sold for £850 million to Sir Philip Green, ending in 2002, through his company Tavita Investments, owned by Tavita Limited. This saw the company become a privately listed company once more, and it was removed from the London Stock Exchange after 73 years, but still continued with their designer collaboration strategy, thereby beginning TopShop's glory years, firstly with Zandra Rhodes in 2002. Over the next 10 years, TopShop would come to define British high street shopping, especially with its Oxford Street location becoming a real destination for anyone that could feasibly get to London for a day of shopping. Their designer collabs and their own catwalk shows slowly helped them gain a reputation for being ahead of fashion, and they soon regularly began showing up in magazines like Vogue and would even become the first high street brand ever to advertise in Vogue, with Vogue even going on to create a separate cheap chic guide in 2004 to house all of the high street looks that one could buy at a fraction of the cost. You see, for decades upon decades, fast fashion hadn't really existed as a fashionable option. In order to buy something truly fashionable, one would either have to buy directly from a designer or buy a lesser version of that from the high street or diffusion line. But now that manufacturing facilities were speeding up and becoming cheaper thanks in large part to production facilities overseas, it became easier for the high street shopper to have their fashionable needs met, which meant that the demand for affordable fashion increased exponentially and helped cement this idea that TopShop could be ahead of the fashion game, just as much as a designer brand could, immediately reducing a gap in the market that TopShop were exceptionally well positioned for. But in my opinion, the most astonishing thing about this is that logistics-wise, TopShop weren't even the leader. That was very famously Zara. But what TopShop managed to succeed in was the positioning of the brand as a fashion leader, with its very heavy ties to London Fashion Week, even in 2005 debuting their own catwalk collections at London Fashion Week themselves under TopShop Unique for the Spring-Summer 06 season, becoming the first high street brand ever to grace the stage and pretty much the only high street retailer accepted by the high fashion crowd. The collections were still designed by Nick Passmore and the 14 other women that were already working as the TopShop Unique in-house design team that had actually begun 10 seasons prior in 2001 as mentioned, but now this was being reworked for much larger promotional purposes. Interestingly though, unlike other designer brands, neither Passmore nor the other 14 women would ever really be at the forefront of the design label. Instead, it was heavily connected only to the TopShop brand. But despite this, they did a wonderful job at quickly establishing who TopShop was at this early stage as an amalgamation of inspiration from other designers, something that in most cases for a catwalk brand would be a huge negative. But for a high street brand, it perfectly displayed their democratizing ethos, bringing great design to consumers at a fraction of the price. Something they continued to further with collaborative retail collections as well, including by the following year their now infamously successful Kate Moss collection that had crowds of people queuing up for hours on end. By 2007, they were also showing their catwalk collections abroad, including as shown in this video from Singapore, opening global flagship stores, with the most notable being a huge store in New York, for which the crowds were lined around the block as well. In 2011, they entered Australia, 2012, they entered South Africa, and in 2013, in France. TopShop, obviously, by this point was a global phenomena, the best of retailing. Still to this day, we have never seen another high street phenomena like this, and their profits reflected exactly that, skyrocketing year on year despite the British high street and, very importantly, despite Arcadia as a whole starting to see a major dip. In fact, the brand had become so big that it really defined the late 2000s and early 2010s in a way that most millennials, especially those into fashion, would have a hard time ignoring. TopShop's clothing was easily as desirable as any designer brand at this time, regularly releasing top it items of the season, and they were desirable over actual designer labels. Most famously, the Jamie skinny jeans in 2012 that both boys and girls alike would buy and wear so ubiquitously that they're now a fundamental haunt of millennial style. This was also achieved through their continued use of down-market collaborations, including, but not limited to, Danielle Scott, Emma Cook, Christopher Kane, Mario Schwab, Richard Nicol, David Comer, Jonathan Saunders, and Sophie Bagg, Ashish, Mary Katranzu, Maria Francesca Pepe, Steve Morris, Pamela Love, Michael van der Ham, Simone Rocha, J.W. Anderson, Louise Gray, Medium Kirchhoff, and Marcus Almeida, all before they switched up their strategy to celebrities, which was somewhat recatalyzed by Kate Bosworth's 2013 collection, announcing Beyoncé's Ivy Park collection in 2014 by releasing that in 2016, and Kendall and Kylie Jenner's collab in 2015. They also began purposefully perpetuating the idea of mixing and matching high and low fashions as a way to show that you had true style. Or, as Jane Shepherdson, head of this rebrand since the early 90s, said, "Dressing head to toe in designer, anyone can do that if you got the money. But we're not talking about money, we're talking about style." And frankly, this campaign was just extremely successful. So much so that we still see this idea today, even in the extremely wealthy. But just to be clear, it's not that this didn't happen before, but that it became popularized as a way to affect one's own personal branding. Whether it's becoming relatable like the Royals, or whether it's making a statement about being savvy and cool like Alexa Chung. So, obviously, throughout all of this time, from an external perspective, TopShop was the place to be, and the only store that outsold TopShop by this point was Top Man, who they really weren't competing against. However, there was one threat that unfortunately for Arcadia would very slowly pull the rug from underneath TopShop. Online retailing in this time had been growing slowly but surely. In the UK, the market leader was ASOS, having started in 2001 as seen here. But the consensus at this time with online retailing in general was that firstly, there was a risk of scams and stealing, and second, that even on trusted websites like Amazon, people just wouldn't buy fashion because they couldn't ensure it fit them well. So, it was mostly just used to supplement brick and mortar stores instead of being a standalone retailer. Though actually, Arcadia did have an online store that was begun as far back as the 14th of June 1999 as Zoom.com, which housed all of the Arcadia Group brands. Though, after a month, 50% of the stock was sold to Associated newspapers, so that would have cut into the profits quite significantly. As it happened, they didn't really seem to do much with it at all, and only actually saw this boost when ASOS rebranded to this. So, though ASOS's quality was lesser, the ease of shopping, not having to go to the otherwise dying and quite miserable British High Street, and the idea of having something that few other people would have due to ASOS's large stock, gradually began to take that ever-important younger customer away from TopShop. But it's not that TopShop didn't know that the High Street was dying, because they made several attempts to innovate, including the launch of TopShop To Go in 2004, in which a style advisor came to your house for free with no pressure to buy to show you the whole collection. They launched online in 2006 in the UK, which quickly became 30% of the whole company's turnover, leading them to launch TopShop Express in the UK in 2007 that would have orders delivered to your door in as little as 3 hours. And by September 2008, they finally launched a global store to much demand that had the Japanese and American markets particularly excited, having been void of this extremely desirable brand for the last decade. So, it's not that TopShop was really late to the game. They had a store online, they had incredible delivery speed, they were literally global, they were trying to innovate. But they also had enormous brick and mortar presence that was both costly in terms of rent and would prove to be a huge burden when trying to reformat the logistics to a totally different form of retailing. A burden that simply their competitors just didn't have. However, aside from brick and mortar costs, there was one more real point of weakness for TopShop emerging at this time. Because, as we discussed earlier, a fundamental point of any brand that aims for a narrow target market, such as teens, has a built-in need to reimagine themselves within the time bracket that they are targeting. And though TopShop was not doing inherently badly whatsoever at all, by the fact that they weren't rebranding, it began to evidence a needle shift in who they were targeting. You see, while they had previously been targeting 13 to 24-year-olds, it had been around 20 years since they had their rebranding in 1990. So, the newer generation clearly could not have been their main focus. evidenced by their promotional efforts as well, like a huge promotional push of TopShop Freshers Week, which is the first week a student goes to university in England, in which we traditionally get blackout drunk every single day. So obviously can only target those last few ages in their demographic, ignoring the previous 5 years. And their focus on using online services to gamify the in-store shopping experience with a brand known as Scavenger in 2011 after app sales raised to 8%. Which, because of the raised app sales, does sound great on paper. But considering this was in 2011, and LTE, at least for me, was only released in August 2013 with Vodafone, we just didn't use our phones in this way then. Frankly, it was just too early to expect everyone, especially minors, to have internet on their phones. We simply just didn't use our phones like that back in those days. If it came out now for the 11-year-olds at Sephora, I'm sure this idea would do phenomenally well. But back in 2011, before LTE, this was just throwing away their resources. So, these ideas, though great on paper for their demographic, and I remember my university professors constantly going on about how gamifying shopping and experiential marketing was the way forward for retail, it was foolish to continue targeting the upper half of their demographic with only limited years in the bracket left, while largely ignoring the younger end with the next potential 11 years of spending. All of which evidencing the very early signs that the needle was in fact slipping. And honestly, that they were also being reckless with their spending, something that those responsible quite explicitly say in their Open University interviews. Though they do also say in these interviews that their target market was now expanded to people in their 20s and 30s, which if that is the case, then their planning is better, but they hadn't actually been successful in ridding themselves of being perceived as aiming the younger kids, somewhat of a fundamental flaw, as it effectively removes one of the 6 key facets of retailing identity if you're using Capra's identity prism. They were still on top of the fashion world for now, for sure. But ignoring the youngest part of their perceived demographic and losing focus on who TopShop was for would soon be at least partially responsible for their downfall. As a result, slowly ASOS, without the major cost of TopShop's 300 plus brick-and-mortar stores, gained market share from them, and soon other online retailers emerged in that space as well. And it certainly didn't help that the other companies under Arcadia had long been struggling because of the dying British high street and heavy, almost monopolist presence of Arcadia brands on said high street that was causing just a huge financial strain from the parent company onto their only 2 profitable companies, TopShop and Topman. Likely to help this situation for the parent company, as early as 2012, measures were taken to inject money into the Arcadia Group through the sale of 25% of TopShop to Leonard Green and Partners, who were to help them expand across America. However, while this is true that it did help them expand through America at this time, and it valued the pair, TopShop and Topman, at a colossal £2 billion, which at the time would have been about $3 billion US. There was a notable shift in their focus away from the British high street, as in as few as 5 years saw them begin to close stores globally, most famously in Australia, where they went into voluntary administration after rising debt, an unfortunate consequence of a string of small but impactful substandard decisions, namely a lack of focus online, not rebranding since 2001, having too vague of a target market, not closing brick-and-mortar stores when it was clear they were a huge unnecessary expense, and having a heavy focus on expensive and also unnecessary international expansion, all of which led them to misunderstand their core and developing customer base. And it was exactly this that allowed the competitors to take over, eventually resulting in the forced closure of stores due to debt, and even the wind down of the catwalk shows, which I believe they had their last in spring-summer 18. This, then in 2019, was followed up by a much-watched BBC documentary that exposed the owner of TopShop, Philip Green, for his ruthless demeanor, and though he didn't break any laws according to a previous investigation, had a somewhat morally unethical way of doing business, including the £1.2 billion his wife Tina Green was awarded a decade and a half prior, though avoided paying any tax due to her living in Monaco, as well as having racist and misogynistic words and actions. Really, in the public eye, this was the nail in the coffin. As though his behavior was well known among the public who were interested in retailing, for those that perhaps were less aware, the documentary just really blew up the awareness of how difficult he was as a person and simply made a good percentage of their now dwindling remaining customer base less want to shop there. By 2020, as Corona put further strain on retailers, it was very clear that TopShop and Arcadia as a whole really were not going to survive. And by that November, they had already announced bankruptcy. An enormous fall from grace for a company that only a few years prior was valued at $2 billion. Obviously, TopShop's demise is directly linked to Arcadia's failure, but because this video is about TopShop as a business analysis, it's important to understand that just one golden pig can make a company like Arcadia stay afloat, as it had done for so many years before this point. But because TopShop had not rectified all of the issues we discussed earlier, it just didn't keep up with the times, and the Arcadia golden pig tarnished, ending the year 2020 with only 11 stores. By 2021, the extremely long bankruptcy process of all of Arcadia's assets was continuing. I believe the Oxford Street store had sold for somewhere around £500 million, though most of that went to pay the mortgage, and a good portion of the Arcadia Group, including TopShop, Topman, Miss Selfridge, and Hit, was sold to ASOS for £330 million. But by 2023, ASOS too were already exploring a sale of the TopShop brand. For now, that's really where TopShop lies, on its 60th anniversary, still on ASOS as just a real shell of who it had once been, selling budget, average clothes with no unique cohesive vision. Personally, I think there's a lot to be learned from this, putting too many eggs in one basket, not focusing on the whole group's portfolio as a result, which led to a dependence on one brand, which itself led to perhaps a fear that rebranding would fail and topple the whole empire, when in fact it was this avoidance of said branding that left it feeling uncool and ultimately left to a very slow death as their target aged out. Could TopShop return? Obviously yes. But it had such a huge impact in the 2010s that the rebrand for the company would need to be decisive and extremely heavily branded. I'd also imagine they would need to put significant funds into regaining their fashionable status and obviously distancing themselves from Philip Green as well. Honestly, even if this does happen, I don't know if we will see this anytime soon. I know that 2010s fashion is coming back into style for the younger ones, but the name TopShop is so heavily tied to millennials that I'm not sure if it's a desirable side of 2010s fashion or not. I guess in the end, only time will tell, because really, so little is certain in retail. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please do leave a like and subscribe for more videos like this one. For videos like this, but about beauty brands, please check out my beauty channel Underskin, and an extra thank you goes out to my patrons over on Patreon, some of whose names are on the screen now.